I'm John Batchelor. Steve Cohen of New York University is here. Steve's piece is going up quickly at The Nation online and then The Nation magazine about the very weak reporting by the American media to the American people about the conditions in Ukraine, but generally about how Russia views the conduct of the American presidents these last decades. Mr. Clinton, Mr. Bush, Mr. Clinton, Mr. Bush, and Mr. Obama, all of them. I want to go to Vladimir Putin's view of the United States, not just now, but in these last years, at least since his first election, when he rescued what was a tattered economy and a plunging GDP and reorganized Russia. Steve, Vladimir Putin, a 3 times elected president, is regarded by the American media as a punchline, a cartoon figure. He has very high approval rating in Russia. He is now seen as the backbone to Yanukovych in Kiev, the elected president. Vladimir Putin must win Ukraine, correct, Steve? He must win this. This isn't something he can watch fritter away from him as if it was an economic investment. This is his presidency. Is that too much of a statement, Steve?
It's not enough of a statement. It's his legacy. I have a friend in Russia who's about as objective as Russians can get, who put it to me like this. Putin could have a disaster at Sochi. He won't have it, but he was making the point. And it would have no comparison if he was to lose Ukraine. Right. Because if Ukraine were to leave its close relationship with Russia while Putin is president, Putin would go down as an infamous Russian leader.
Putin conferring with Yanukovych. We're told this in news reports. Yanukovych traveled to Sochi and sat with the president.
Yeah.
My indication is that they must move, and they will wait till the end of the Sochi Olympics. How will they move, Steve? What's your expectation? What is your information from Moscow?
Well, there are reports by Americans primarily in European newspapers, including what used to be called the International Herald Tribune and is now called the International New York Times, but they're published in Europe, that Putin is waiting until after Sochi, when the world looks away, or when the backlash can't harm the image of the games.
When the NBC cameras leave the region.
Yeah, and all the reporters leave.
Right.
And at that moment, he may, they're not saying he will, but these reports are preparing us to think he will, enact what they call a military takeover of Ukraine. And if Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, doesn't have enough forces to do that himself, Putin will send Russian forces dressed in Ukrainian uniforms. Now, there is absolutely no evidence that such a plan is underway. But of course you could say, well, if there is such a plan, it would be secret and we wouldn't have the evidence. So as a theoretical, hypothetical possibility, we can think about it. But it would be inconsistent, utterly inconsistent, with everything Putin has done and said as a foreign policy leader since he became president 13, 14 years ago. And I would say that he, Putin, would regard resorting to Russian military force in Ukraine as nearly equally destructive of his presidency and his legacy. Because for Russians, however much they consider Ukrainians their brothers, and there are tens of millions of intermarriages. Gorbachev's mother was Ukrainian. My wife, Katrina Vanden Heuvel, and I have many, many friends in Russia who have Ukrainian spouses. Russians would regard the firing on Ukrainians, for whatever reason, as a kind of mortal sin. So I don't think it's an option. But the West is pushing Putin very hard. And let me make a point that's not made in the American media. The subject of my Nation article is how the media has distorted Russia, Putin, Sochi, Ukraine. Part of that is that the European offer to Ukraine is presented as a very benign offer. This partnership that will offer them democracy, prosperity, and an escape from Russia. But embedded in the 1,000-word document is what's called a security agreement. And if you read it, it's clear that if Ukraine signs, it's bound to NATO. It doesn't become a member of NATO, but it becomes a de facto member of NATO. As you know and have pointed out, the Russian naval base is in Ukraine, in Crimea. So Russians see this ongoing Western assault in Ukraine, not just as economic, but also as military, as NATO. And that, of course, could provoke a dangerous reaction from Russia. I think that it began with the White House and Brussels playing with metaphorical fire, and now they're playing with real fire.
Last week, Victoria Nuland, who is the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, in other words, the boss at the State Department, she's a Foreign Service officer, so she's civil service, but in any event, she's worked for both administrations, recorded, and the recording put up on YouTube and taunted by an agent of the Kremlin, conferring with the ambassador of the United States to the Ukraine, picking winners for the protests against Yanukovych. Steve, there is clear evidence, and there has been for some time, that the State Department, the NSC, are interfering. I won't speak to how Moscow regards this because I don't need to use vulgarity, but I will point to Angela Merkel, Chancellor of all the Germans, who did not take that as amusing. She saw this as more American interference in European affairs.
She's very angry about this.
Very angry.
This comes on the heels of her fury when she learned from Snowden that the White House was tapping her personal cell phone.
And so the breakdown of trust between Moscow and Washington includes the breakdown of trust between Berlin and Washington. This is a European crisis, not a Russian crisis.
Let's go to this Nuland taped telephone.
All right, when we come back, because we're going to speak to the immediate bad relations between Moscow and Washington and Berlin, and we're going to say how we got here. Afghanistan, Iraq, Georgia, Ukraine, all the way up to reset Snowden and the sudden exit of the American ambassador to Russia, Mr. McFaul, within these last days. Steve Cohen, Russian history at New York University. His piece on The Nation is up presently about how the American media, big-time media, all the majors in the East, all big magazines, have not conveyed the facts of Ukraine and of Russia these last years. I'm John Batchelor.